everyone, my name is Angelique.
Hi, I'm Natalie.
I'm Kayla.
And I'm Caitlin, and we are going to be talking about relationships and the correlation it has with well-being. And we're going to cover a number of different topics, and those are consisting of the importance of relationships, how we measure well-being, the presence of relationships, quality of relationships, types of relationships, and then COVID's impact on relationships. And we also just want to apologize in advance if we do have any technical difficulties, as we are still navigating through Zoom. There's one right there. Okay. So the first topic that we are going to talk about today is going to be the importance of relationships. And the main question that we're asking in covering this topic is, why do we seek out relationships? So the main reason that we seek out relationships is for the need to belong. We have found that the importance of relationships is just directly correlated to this. We realize that we're all social creatures, and we often turn solo activities into those that we can do with groups. For example, studying, you go out on coffee dates with friends so that you aren't studying alone. Or if you want to go on a walk, you'll invite friends with you so that there's multiple of you. So we derive a lot of meaning from these relational bonds that we have with other people. Another example is that if we were to think back on some of our favorite memories, they most likely involved experiences with other people included in them. So relationships are a source of intimacy and closeness. They also provide us with comfort and relief whenever we have stressful instances, or if we have an exam, or just really any struggles that we're going through in life. They also help us with accountability and making sure that we're doing what we're supposed to do, accomplishing our goals, getting things turned in on time. And they also help with just bettering our health. And this all relates to our overall better well-being. So this presentation, again, will just dive into the different types of relationships that we have with others and the presence and importance of relationships during these hard times.
All right, so now before covering how social relationships, well-being, and happiness are connected, it's important to understand how they're measured. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit next. All right, so firstly, there's two ways to measure social relationships, which includes objective social variables and subjective social variables. Now, the objective social variable is based on evidence over opinions. It's usually a single correct answer. So these examples might include relationship status, like if you're married or you're single, usually there's only one answer there. Your social network size, and social integration, which is the degree to which members feel accepted by the social networks. As for subjective social variables, it takes personal feelings over facts. And a key variable includes social support, which is the extent to which individuals feel cared for and can receive help from others. Now, in addition to the other two approaches I previously mentioned, there is one other newfound way, which is called the daily diary methodology. And this approach lets researchers examine in-moment instances and day-to-day trends of how social relationships affect happiness and well-being. And it's basically what it sounds. You kind of just write down how you're feeling about your relationship, things that are working, things aren't working, and then researchers can take a look at that and kind of form conclusions based off of what you have written down in your day-to-day diary.
So next we kind of want to talk on what is measured in measuring happiness and well-being. So the first thing that's measured is going to be subjective well-being. And this is pretty much psychology's fancy scientific way of saying happiness. So within subjective well-being, there's kind of three components that are looked at. The first one is high life satisfaction. And this refers to the positive evaluations of one's own life in general. The next is going to be positive feelings. So this is referring to the number of positive emotions that one experiences in their life, or they feel like they're experiencing. So these are going to be emotions such as joy or peace. And the last one is low negative feelings. So this refers to the number of negative feelings that one experiences in their life. And these are going to be things like sadness or anger. So the way that this is measured is usually using a 1 to 7 scale, 1 being strongly disagree with the prompt given and 7 being strongly agree. So researchers usually will then total up the score for each question that was answered related to happiness. And then, for example, if there were 5 questions and someone scored a 5, so they basically answered strongly disagree on each one, then they would fall into the category of being extremely dissatisfied in relation to their well-being. Whereas if someone gave like medium answers for all of the questions, they scored a 21 or something, they would be slightly satisfied with their well-being. And it kind of just goes so on, either higher or lower, or however they answer the questions. The second thing that's measured is going to be physical dimension of well-being, or kind of just like your physical health. So a lot of the times we look at health in terms of injury or disease or mortality. However, it can also include things like physiological factors such as blood pressure or the strength of one's immune system. And then there's also health behaviors that are things like dietary consumption, how much you exercise, how much you smoke. So researchers just kind of want to see how relationships affect someone's health in the way of like, if someone has a lot of relationships, are they more prone to smoking? Are they more prone to exercising? And just affecting that or relating that to well-being as well. So as you can see, there are a variety of physical dimensions of well-being measured to better understand the effect of relationships on one's well-being.
So when investigating the connection between social relationships and well-being, researchers consider 2 major elements. The first major element that we're going to talk about is the presence of relationships. So our textbook talks about the presence of relationships and how the more social relationships that an individual has, the more positively one's sense of well-being, overall wellness, is impacted. Social connectedness on a spectrum, so not referring to a specific amount of relationships a person has, results in lower stress levels, less distress, and less fatigue. These results were found in a study that I came across that focused on a population of people during the middle of the COVID pandemic. So when we talk about the presence of relationships, it isn't just limited to romantic relationships. We're also talking about friendships, whether that's close proximity or distance, intimate relationships, online connections, workplace relationships, and family connections. So continuing on presence of relationships, one study found that relationships influenced undergraduate students the most compared to other factors like gender, exercise, habits, and religion. When an individual doesn't have social connections, it can lead to feelings of loneliness and isolation, as well as depression and maybe even ostracism when the individual is excluded from groups and possibly ignored by others. Close relationships lead to improvements in mental and physical wellness, but current research from the time of the COVID pandemic showed that even weak ties and weak relationships restore people's sense of belonging and well-being. Some psychologists even say that relationships are just as important as basic necessities like food and water. So going on to our next section, quality of relationships, I wanted to bring up a question for you to ponder, not just during this presentation or when you're reviewing your notes for social psychology, but also just for your own understanding of what's important to you and your life with your relationships and friendships and other connections. So is relationship quality more important to you? Is quantity more important, or are both equally important to you? So while you're thinking about that, I wanted to talk about some current research being done on quality versus quantity of relationships and the relationship between those 2 components. So when we look at how quality affects happiness, researchers do agree that higher quality friendships are associated with increased happiness. One characteristic that forms a high quality relationship is strong social support. One cross-cultural study found that college students with strong social support reported higher overall levels of life satisfaction, higher positive affect, and lower negative affect. However, both quality and quantity of relationships matter. Psychologists and researchers both agree that larger social networks and high quality relationships together within those social circles improves overall well-being, while small social networks with low quality relationships not only negatively impacts the individual, but it actually harms the individual's overall well-being.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some types of relationships. The two main types of relationships are formal and informal. And a question I have for everyone listening is, think of a relationship you're a part of or a relationship that you have been a part of, and see if that fits into the formal or informal category. So, formal relationships, they are less relaxed and they are more, you have to have more self-control in order to continue this formal relationship. And the book states that it's bound by rules of politeness, and you're always just kind of being aware of how you're acting and you can't really be yourself. Some examples of this are the workplace relationships that people have, relationships with professors and new acquaintances. And then on the other side, we have informal relationships where you can be more comfortable, you can be yourself, you can be vulnerable. And the book says you can express true feelings in these relationships and you can be authentic and be yourself. Some examples of this are friends, siblings, significant others, and many other relationships. And these informal relationships are relationships that we think of often when we think of relationships. So I think that's awesome. And then another part of informal relationships are intimate relationships. And so the more intimate relationships we have, the more likely that is going to translate to more happiness. And the most common intimate relationship in the world is marriage. And while research points to marriage being associated with higher rates of happiness, it doesn't really guarantee that getting married will make you happy. And it's important to note that quality of marriage matters too. So you can't expect to have more happiness from a bad marriage that makes you feel bad about yourself. Yeah. And then another type of relationship are work relationships. And work relationships are often more forced than other relationships. There's coworkers and supervisors and many varieties of this too. This also ties into what Caitlin said about nurses and doctors, and if they had a quality relationship, it led to greater well-being. High quality work relationships make jobs less stressful and more enjoyable. And positive relationships with both of these types of people at work leads to greater well-being. On the other hand, supervisors and coworkers that are a source of stress have a more negative impact, and relationships can have an impact on job performance as well.
All right, so it's safe to say COVID-19 has impacted our lives in more ways than one. I know it has mine, and I'm sure it has yours. And one area specifically that COVID-19 has majorly influenced is individuals' personal and interpersonal relationships. So, as you all know, as a result of COVID-19, we were all forced to go into lockdown to protect both ours and others' health, which meant that we were all spending a lot more time, an unusual amount of time at home, which can put more stress on interpersonal relationships. So a study was conducted to explore the impact COVID-19 had on couples' relationships, and the study was taken from our book. Researchers used online surveys to gather data, and what the study found was that those who were younger and had higher levels of anxiety and depression and had shorter relationships were the most affected. And these results can be interpreted using a relationships conceptual framework. So since they were younger, they weren't used to dealing with big issues. And since the relationship was shorter, they weren't as capable as adapting. And since they already were experiencing anxiety and depression before COVID-19, it made them a little bit more psychologically worse off to deal with COVID-19 and the stress that comes with experiencing such an unprecedented event like a global pandemic.
So the next application of the effect that relationships have during related to COVID is between frontline doctors and nurses and their partners that they had outside of the workplace. So this study does support our learning that relationships and well-being are directly correlated, especially between these of people who are in extremely stressful jobs or in extremely stressful time. So this study actually found that the doctors and nurses' personal relationships really helped to aid the stress of the work that they were doing. Most of the doctors and the nurses and their partners that participated in the surveys felt that they were very supported by their partners, which ultimately resulted in them being less affected during the emotional, stressful time of them working during COVID and being in very vulnerable positions of getting sick to something that we don't really know a lot about. So this study just proved that strong and healthy relationships promote well-being and take away and diminish stress. It also found out that the stress and resilience on one's relationship actually did help result in those relationships between the doctors, nurses, and their partners becoming more prideful, supportive, and just overall strengthened. So the stress that these doctors and nurses had to endure was pretty much handled a lot better due to the relationships that they had and overall promoted their well-being.
All right, so now that we have a general understanding of relationships, their importance and how they are measured, and their connection to well-being, the question becomes now, how can we apply all of what we learned to our lives? And so one important thing to take away from this presentation is the understanding that when it comes to relationships, quality is super, super important, as Angie had touched on before. And our book kind of talks about how even finding one person that you can really truly be yourself around, and they refer to this person as a confidant. So this is someone who could be your lover, it could be your family member, it could be a peer, or just could be someone who you really genuinely trust and can share your thoughts and feelings and experiences with wholeheartedly without the fear of being judged or ridiculed, can result in a greater happiness. It is also scientifically referred to as subjective well-being, as Caitlin had talked on before. And to greater illustrate this point, we will briefly take a look at a study that was in our book, where they took 123 nations of people of all ages, and it found that even having a few high-quality social relationships was consistently linked with higher subjective well-being. So it just means that if you just have a couple people who are close to you, who you really feel like you can be yourself around, it can lead to person than you would be without a confident or someone who you really trust to navigate the complexities of life.
Well, so now you know more about relationships and how they impact well-being. So thank you so much for everyone who has listened to this. We really appreciate it. Oh, and here are our references.